In 2008, while recovering from a major health issue, I bought my first house at the very top of the Blue Mountains, just outside of Sydney, Australia. The town dates back to the 1830s and was originally a coal and timber workers' settlement. It was also a place for travelers from Sydney to stay the night before they made the journey down to the other side of the Great Dividing Range. The Great Dividing Range is what became the prime grazing land of the Western Plains beyond. Later in the 19th century, the township became a retreat for wealthy elites who built elaborate holiday homes to escape the heat of the Sydney summer. There are a few of these homes still standing, including a beautiful manor built by the once powerful Australian media family, the Fairfaxes. There was also a large hotel, now a pub, named after a member of British royalty who once stayed for one single night. The township is nowhere near as fancy now, returning to its working roots during the week and welcoming Sydney day trippers on weekends. While I'll always love it, it has to be admitted that the town has seen better days, livelier ones too. My cottage definitely wasn't one of the mini mansions. Local lore says that my house was both a stable as well as a place where coachmen from the colonial era Cobb and Company carriage service would rest for the night. This was before continuing into Sydney or continuing down into the Hartley Valley via the treacherously steep Victoria's Pass. When I bought the house, it was a rudimentary shack with a small kitchen, living room, bathroom, and a closed-in porch that acted as the bedroom. I found out shortly after I moved in that the two previous owners before the man I bought it from had died suddenly in that house. One was a woman whom I'll call Susan. Soon after Susan passed away at a respectable age, her much younger nephew inherited the house, and within weeks, he passed away alone in the house from a sudden heart attack. The first night I stayed there, I was on a foam mattress on the floor in the living room because the movers were arriving the next day, and the room had a fireplace so I could stay warm. That night, as I slept by the fire, I had a feeling there was something off about the room, like I was being watched by someone, or something, not entirely friendly. But I told myself it was my mind playing tricks on me in an unfamiliar environment. The next day, I furnished the bedroom and slept there from then on. Aside from that strange first night and a nagging sense that I was somehow weirdly intruding on someone else's space, I was mostly comfortable in my little home. It was a shelter from the storm that was my life at that stage. Soon, things would change. I began waking in the middle of the night to what felt like someone pulling at my blankets and sitting on the edge of my bed. I was aware of the phenomenon of sleep paralysis and wrote it off as simply that, telling no one so I didn't appear as if my mind was having issues, along with my body. Because of this, I started finding more reasons to go back to Sydney. Anything to get a peaceful night's sleep, something that didn't really happen to me at my home. Thankfully, I got some desired company and sense of safety in numbers when my mother would drive up to stay with me for a night. Every so often she would do this to check on me, and there was only one bedroom, so we shared the bed, with me sleeping closest to the door that led to the kitchen. Weeks after one of her visits, I traveled down to Sydney for an appointment the next day and stayed with my mother. That night in Sydney, when we were alone, my mother said she needed to ask me something. It's important to know that my mother is exceedingly calm, intelligent, prudent, and is the definition of level-headed. But still, she looked at me with a grave look, and in a quiet voice she asked simply, "Do you remember anything from the night I stayed?" I was taken aback and replied that I didn't, just that I woke up tired, as if I had a fitful sleep, but nothing was new. It was then that she took a deep breath and told me something I'll never forget. Mom said that night she had woken with start in the middle of the night and looked over the top of me sleeping soundly next to her in the doorway. Mom said that she had been awoken in the middle of the night and looked over the top of me sleeping soundly. Next to her, and next to the doorway to the kitchen, there was a head near the tip of the bed. Standing there was the image of a severe-looking woman with gray hair. She was scowling, staring at my mother with what was described as malice. As if that wasn't startling enough, my mother went on to say that at that moment, I suddenly sat straight up in my bed, my upper body at a right angle to my legs, blocking her view of the doorway. I then started mumbling tersely in my sleep. A few moments later, I laid back down quietly, and by then, Mom said she saw the vision of the woman was gone. Being about 3 times her weight and a foot taller than her, I'm very protective of my mother. All these years later, I wonder if it was me trying to act as my mom's bodyguard against whatever stood in the doorway that night. Several years later, I'd sympathetically renovated the property, creating an open floor plan, kitchen, dining, living room, adding a second bedroom, and turning the old living room, the room I stayed in that night, into a bedroom. Just weeks after the renovation was finished in late autumn, I was down in Sydney for another bloody medical appointment on what was an unseasonably hot and gusty day. As I sat in the waiting room, I checked the app that tracked local bushfires and saw alerts for one approaching my town. I drove like a maniac up the mountains, all the time looking at the terrifyingly huge cloud of gray and black smoke in front of me. 15 minutes after screeching to a halt in my driveway, my neighbor and I received an emergency service text from the government saying that we had to evacuate immediately. My neighbor and I packed up our cars. They tell you to have, as part of your bushfire plan, a list of all the items you want to take with you. I now realize why your mind turns to mush with panic. Lena, my neighbor, and I had 2 paths of escape: going down the mountain to Sydney, where there were more fires and huge lines of traffic, or going over to the other side of the mountain and down the pass into Hartley Valley. We decided on the latter, taking refuge in Lena's girlfriend's house as we waited to hear if we had homes to return to. Hartley Vale is just as old as the town I live in and has its own dark history, especially to do with the building of what they call the 2 bridges of the pass. Many convicts, including children, lost their lives building the road into what are essentially rocky cliffs, and until recently, countless carriages and trucks have fallen over the edges of the pass deep into the valley below. Ghost stories from the pass abound. Our first stop before her girlfriend's house was the restaurant Lena runs, out of a beautiful old historic hotel there. Lena went to grab wine from her cellar, wisely knowing that we had a long night ahead with frayed nerves that needed dulling. As I waited, I wandered through the dining room and then on into the back rooms. I was surprised to find these rooms, though empty of furniture, were in their original state from the 19th century. The history nut in me was delighted, but at the same time, I remember that even though it was late afternoon on a day hot enough to be classified as having a catastrophic bushfire danger, the rooms were eerily cold. I remarked on this over our second or third glass of wine later in the evening at Lena's girlfriend's house, and Lena very plainly said, "You felt it too." Lena and her partner went on to tell me numerous ghost stories about cutlery moving overnight, especially when the place is empty after closing, and other spooky happenings as well. It was so normal to them that they might as well have been describing the color of the walls and what they had on the menu. Realizing that I was in safe company, I told Lena and her girlfriend about the going-ons in my house over the years. I described what my mother had seen, and Lena's mouth fell open as I described a woman with gray hair. "That's Susan." I was open-mouthed at first, but at the same time, it all started making sense. I then told them how hard it was to fall asleep through the night there, and asked if Lena could recommend anything that could help me get a quieter night's sleep. What did Susan like? What could I do to calm her presence, shall we say? "Your mother has cats, doesn't she?" I replied yes. Bob and Louis were Mom's pride and joy, and had just moved with her into a small apartment as Mom downsized from her former house. Lena suggested I bring the cats up with me next time I came back from Sydney. Susan loved cats, she said. I resolved to do exactly that, assuming I had a house rather than a pile of ash to come back to. Well, The volunteer firefighters fought valiantly and were able to stop the fire 3 doors from our houses. I'll forever be grateful for all the amazing work they did that day and continue to do. I kept my word, and a few weeks later, I brought Bob and Louis home with me for a visit. They loved the house, and having a garden again made something shift that weekend. The house felt warmer, lighter, and brighter. Things were so peaceful that I fell asleep on the couch in front of the TV on the cat's final night with me. In the middle of the night, I awoke to a woman again, with gray hair leaning over me. Her face was so close to mine that I instinctually rolled away, falling off the couch and onto the floor. I sprang up onto my 2 feet and rushed to turn on the lights. Of course, the room was empty except for me and 2 sleepy-eyed felines who looked at me with bemusement as I stood by the switch at the wall. My heart was pounding out of my chest. It was only later that night, as I laid in bed trying to decipher it all, I remembered a detail that I'd missed in my shock. The gray-haired woman wasn't scowling. She was smiling, so broadly that I could still see her teeth in my mind. I think Susan, as I'm now quite certain that it was her, was trying to let me know how happy she was that I brought the cats to visit her. The energy in the house was different the next day and every day after. Something had shifted, and though I had to sell the house years later and return to Sydney full time, I became healthy enough to work. I never saw her again after that night, and I only slept soundly. Well, except for one night. But that's another story about another ghost for another time. I'll always miss my little house that Susan so graciously let me care for after her. One day I want to buy it back. I hope Susan will welcome me home when I do.